Hello and welcome to the Political Orphanage, a home for plucky misfits and problem solvers. I'm your host, Andrew Heaton, a man who graduated from a college whose mascot is a stagecoach. We've got a fun chat with a sharp guest today about the underlying structural problems of higher ed, specifically the tippy-top elite institutions. If you want to make college more affordable for the average American, if you want to fix the system and make it less inequitable, less elitist, and more accessible, this episode is for you. But also, if you just kind of hate snotty elite institutions and you want to mug on them for a while about how awful they are and figure out specific ways that they're awful, this episode is also for you. You can pick your emotional orientation. But before we get into that, before we get into the mechanics and the structure of higher ed, I want to frame things with a thought experiment. It's summer, and you're strolling around your neighborhood after dark. It's cooled down a little, it's nice out. There are some fireflies. And then, out of nowhere, in the sky, you see a UFO. This big, silver flying saucer lands in a field across the street from you, and the gangplank descends. And a big, skinny, gray alien climbs down from this intergalactic vehicle and paces over to you. And it says, "Take me to the very best, greatest center of learning on your planet. What is the name of the best center of learning? Because I have much technology to share with the planet's top minds." And you say, "Well, I guess that's probably Harvard. Yeah, I can give you directions to Harvard." "Harvard," the alien says. "Harvard is the greatest learning institution on Earth?" "Yeah," you say. "It does really well in U.S. News and World Rankings." I don't remember the name of the magazine, but it does really well on there. It's always in the top 5. And their blazers have crests on them, which is the sign of a truly elite institution, so it's probably the best. "Excellent," says the alien. "Harvard is the most successful university at promulgating knowledge. Therefore, it must logically have the most students of any university on the planet. How many millions of students matriculate there?" "Oh," you say, I don't think I made myself clear. It doesn't have very many students at all, actually, maybe 1,000. And the alien just stares at you for a moment, collecting its thoughts. "On our planet, universities are designed to spread knowledge and to provide skills and critical thinking, which allow great numbers of beings to reach their potential and make the world better. So our best universities are, of course, our largest universities." "Well, that's interesting," you say. "Yeah, it's sort of the opposite here on Earth. Our best universities are also pretty tiny, and for some reason they usually take place inside of castles or buildings that look like castles." And the alien blinks. "But Harvard could not educate more people than it does because, though it is the smartest university, it is the poorest? There is a mismatch of resources?" Oh no," you laugh. "Quite the opposite. Harvard's endowment is literally bigger than the entire economy of Iceland or Jamaica combined. It's huge." The alien continues to stare at you. "Could Harvard use the immense resources at its disposal to create, I don't know, satellite campuses? Replicate the model in numerous locations around the world to make knowledge more accessible to more people?" "No," you say. "I think that would dilute its branding. Yeah, that would be bad for branding. If Harvard just sloshed knowledge around like that, it would become less prestigious. And smart people, but honestly, mostly just well-bred people with a lot of access to money, they would have a harder time getting the best jobs because the degree wouldn't be worth as much. And the alien says, so you would rather have less knowledge, provided the children of wealthy people maintained better stations in life? Yeah, that's. I think that's how our system works. I don't know. I went to a state school, but yes, I think that's how that works. And the alien gets back in the spaceship and flies away. My guest today is Sahaj Sharda. He is the author of The College Cartel, which I am greatly looking forward to talking to him about. You can find that on Amazon, but you can find all of the books that I talk about on this program by going to mightyheaton.com/featured. And Sahaj, I was complimenting you off camera, but I meant it. It is a well-written book. There are a lot of books that I read on the program that are full of wonderful knowledge, but they're a bit dry. It's sort of the kind of stuff that you're like, I'm going to need to drink a glass of milk with this thing. Your book kicked off with fun anecdotes. I enjoyed reading it.
Thank you, Andrew. And thanks so much for having me on the show. I'm really excited to be speaking with you. And as I mentioned off camera, I'm a big fan of yours also.
Yeah. You guys, listeners, you hear that? You hear that? The guest also likes me. Right. Good. Well, we're off to a wonderful start. Well, let's just kick it up to a 10, man. One of the theses of your book is that generally, as Americans, we think of colleges as high-minded nonprofits, and we ought to think of them as cartels. That is a very strong position to take. How do you get there? How do you back it up?
Yeah, so I guess to zoom out for a second, I think, there's all these downstream symptoms that we can see of a sick system. So whether you look at the amount of student loan debt that obviously is never going to get paid back, and is a massive political problem for both parties, whether you look at the rise in tuition prices across the college spectrum, which vastly outpaces inflation by a outstanding figure over the last 20, 30 years. Whether you even look at campus life today, you look at what's happening at the elite colleges, you look at the sort of knife fighting on Twitter and other places between the billionaires who are sort of the donor class of the schools and the academics and administrators who are sort of, the managerial class of the schools. I mean, there's clearly something that is very dysfunctional about the system as it currently exists. And so I wanted to take some time to think about not only what are the symptoms here, and how can we put bandages on the symptoms, but what are the root structural causes? What is the market structural cause that is creating all this dysfunction, all this unaffordability, and frankly, all of this debt, both in terms of monetary debt, but also a moral debt. And so as I started to delve into that question, what I realized is the common conceit of the schools, even if you just study the language that they use, is that these are charitable institutions. They use words like financial aid, like need-blind admissions, they're registered as nonprofits, donations to them are tax deductible. And so they sort of, wear this armor of noblesse, and sort of their ability to present themselves as these sort of higher-minded institutions is very important to them because it's how they sort of legitimate themselves in the political narrative. And yet, when you really get down to it, these are institutions that are engaged in commerce, plain and simple, whether it's the endowments that are engaged in financial markets and often are at the frontiers of different exotic financial instruments, or whether it's the tuition fees that are charged, whether it's the vast majority of contractors and subcontractors and consultants that are attached to these institutions. No matter where you look, these are essentially commercial enterprises. And that was sort of the starting point, the starting insight of the book.
Well, on the note of commercial enterprises, one of the things that I discovered in your book that I did not know is that they, at least when we say colleges, I think for our purposes today, we're going to mostly be talking about elite universities. So Ivy League and Ivy League's little brother type situation. So Ivy League, Stanford, Georgetown, all of those. But when we're talking about them, I had not known that they'd already been prosecuted for price fixing, that there had been lawsuits brought against them for price fixing. And correct me if I'm wrong, they basically went, we're not price fixing. We can't price fix because you can't put a price on education, but we will promise not to do what appears to be price fixing anymore if you drop the charges against us. What happened there?
So that's exactly right. And I think exactly what you're referring to is this case in the 1990s called the overlap case. And essentially what was happening was the 8 Ivy League schools and MIT every spring would get together in, almost this like smoke-filled room and during what was called the overlap meeting. And what they would do is they'd look through the lists of admitted students for overlapping admitted students. And, if Harvard and Dartmouth, for example, had overlapping admitted students, then those two deans would get in, a sort of a sub-discussion about exactly how much financial aid both schools were going to offer this person so that net price, no matter where that person chooses to go, would be roughly equivalent.
Well, and so far, that sounds nice. That sounds like these noblesse oblige institutions which only care about promulgating knowledge and are not in the business of making money, which is, of course, filthy lucre, that they are getting together to ensure that the charges that come before them are given the most robust financial aid packages so that they can obtain said education. So far, that sounds nice.
Right. Yeah. So the missing part of the story, maybe, if you were to be less generous to what the elite colleges were doing there, is that what they were really trying to get at is what is the maximum this family can afford to pay. And, that is, I think, exactly the type of cynical practice the schools have been doing essentially, across their operations for a very, very long time. But this is something that was so blatant, so explicit that the Department of Justice decided to file an antitrust case against them. And then, as you, I think, very rightly pointed out, I think it was Dartmouth whose counsel went to court or went to the press and said, essentially, we're not in the business of selling toasters. And so, these antitrust laws, they shouldn't apply to us because we
we're
are
the good
such
people.
online.
We're the
Right.
good people. So it shouldn't matter if we're doing price fixing because we're the good people.
And that's exactly right. And, this is something that's actually, if you read a lot of antitrust cases, this is something that's actually not so uncommon. There's this famous case, from the early 1900s against Thomas Edison. And what he'd done is he'd sort of monopolized the motion picture industry because he had all the important patents for projector systems. And when he was sued under, this sort of antitrust theory, what he said is, I'm not monopolizing anything because this isn't commerce, this is art. Making pictures, making movies is art. And so the antitrust laws shouldn't apply to this. And it's a very sort of analogous, argument, which is anytime, sort of monopolies become too powerful, too financially powerful, too important, they create these narratives around why it is important for them to actually have that power. And so for Edison, it was this idea that he was sort of bringing from science to man this incredible, astounding form of art that had never been seen before. For the universities, it's this idea that they were going to, pluck from the ether all this knowledge and bring it to society. And so, in actuality, both of those narratives are essentially false. I mean, these are, in essence, commercial enterprises. Edison wasn't the one coming up with these incredible films. He had created the tools so that filmmakers could do that. The universities aren't the ones who are refining and coming up with these insane ideas. It was this prior generation of autodidacts who would really come up with many of the most important ideas. And so the question I think we always have to ask is, whenever anyone says that they're not engaged in commercial enterprise, whenever anyone says that they're not self-interested, what are they actually hiding? And I think in the case of the universities, it is a deep commercial intent.
Yes, I'm in complete agreement with you. I don't believe I'm being cynical when I say this. I think I'm being just very realistic about human nature. Let's avoid using terms like selfless and selfish, both of which are morally loaded, and just say people are autocentric. We understand the world with ourselves at the center of it, regardless of whether we're good or bad people, but we understand ourselves as being the locus point of the universe that we live in, and organizations, which are composed 100% of people, operate the same way. And another example I can give you that I've seen in my own research doing funny videos for Reason is when the federal government started giving large amount of money in federal grants to research institutions as part of the Cold War to develop rockets and whatnot, they initially went, we'll give you up to 8% of the grant back in addition to you, or we'll give you 100% of the grant plus 8% for overhead, because we understand you need to keep the lights on and you need to pay the janitorial staff and all that. And then they eventually took the cap off, and you'll never guess what happened. You'll never guess what happened when they removed the cap. All of a sudden, the overhead expenses went incredibly high, and they didn't roll back at all until somebody audited Stanford and found out they were literally, I'm not making this up, they were using overhead to write off the depreciation on a yacht, among other things. And this is just this, there's always going to be this tendency with a group of human beings that it's good for us to accumulate resources because we're the good people, and let's figure out how to do it. Now, but before we get too far away, I want to make sure that I understand some of the mechanics here. You brought up that there was a price fixing scheme, a collusion scheme between MIT and the Ivy League schools, and that they were fixing the amount of aid that they were giving. How were they doing that exactly? What were the mechanics there?
Yeah, so to start with, what they were doing was this overlap meeting where they were discussing what is the maximum amount this child's family can afford to pay. They would compare notes on that, and then they would try to charge essentially the maximum amount that the family could afford to pay. After the DOJ sued, the schools went to Congress for what was essentially a form of bailout. They said, Congress, please, you guys should, give us a carve-out from the antitrust laws so we can continue to do this type of price fixing. And Congress at that time, again, this was the 90s, the schools had a very different reputation then. The halo was still intact. And Congress said, okay, well, if you're saying this, you must have a good reason for doing this. Technocracy was in vogue at the time. And so Congress passed this antitrust exemption. And using that antitrust exemption, the terms of which were essentially, as long as you practice need-blind admission, you can continue to fix prices on financial aid through the use of a common formula that you share with each other to determine how much a person's family can afford to pay. And eventually those 9 schools, the 8 Ivy League schools and MIT, started to grow and grow and grow, where until in 2022, I think it was something close to 17 schools that were all using this formula to determine the maximum amount a student's family could pay, but many of whom were not practicing need-blind admission. And so there was a second antitrust case, this time from a private plaintiff, a class action case, that alleged that because the schools were not, conducting need-blind admissions, they shouldn't qualify for the antitrust immunity shield, and therefore they were violating the law. And the lawsuit claimed, potentially billions in damages for students. And many of those schools have now settled, have agreed to abandon that price fixing formula. And the story is continuing on that front. But, I think, Andrew, the sort of more important cartel aspect, I think the real core of my book, the main thesis is not around price fixing, but it's really around seat scarcity, which I think is, one of these stories that is so obvious that it's obviously ignored. And, the argument I make in the book is essentially the schools have come up with this ingenious way to work together to limit the amount of growth at any given institution. So Harvard doesn't want to get bigger, Stanford doesn't want to get bigger, Penn doesn't want to get bigger, Princeton doesn't want to get bigger. And when all of them in concert don't want to get bigger, then the amount of power that they have increases year after year after year, because more and more and more qualified students every year want to go to those elite colleges. And so there's a study that I cite in the book, which is that if the schools were even keeping standards the same as 1990 student standards, so not lowering their standards to admit anyone, but just essentially anyone
same
who would
quality thresholds of SAT, ACT scores, et cetera, yeah.
Exactly. So anyone they would have admitted in 1990, they admit today, then their enrollment would have tripled. It would have increased by 300%. And this hasn't happened, obviously. Instead, enrollments have essentially stagnated. Single digit percentage growth in enrollment since the 1980s. And so the question you have to ask is, how have the schools done this? If the laws of economics are you want to sell as much of your product as possible, or before their diminishing returns or something like this, or at least you want to steal your closest competitors' customers, which the schools also do not do, how have the schools managed to maintain so much collaboration and collusion amongst themselves? And the thesis of the book essentially is that something happened in the early 1980s and throughout the 80s and 90s, which is that the elite colleges captured their chief source of rankings, which is the U.S. News and World Report's college rankings. And this is something that's very important because those rankings is how students, sort of understood which colleges were good and weren't good in the sort of now broadened national and international market for elite colleges. And so what happened was the elite colleges essentially went to U.S. News and World Report and said, continue ranking us highly, and in exchange, we will make sure that you are given all the signals as the legitimate college ranking. And so the implicit bargain there was the elite colleges would get to be this cartel, and they would continue to be the incumbents that dominate this cartel. And in exchange, U.S. News and World Report would become the monopoly that ranked that cartel. And both sides gained from this exchange. This was the collusive enterprise at the heart of why there is so much seat scarcity, why Harvard doesn't increase its number of seats, why Princeton doesn't increase its number of seats, because if any of them did, they would fall in the U.S. News and World Report rankings. And this is why U.S. News and World Report is still such a profitable media enterprise, even as so much of the media has become unprofitable and has essentially collapsed.
So let's break this down component by component, because I think it's a very compelling thesis. Let's start with the seat restriction. So if we're looking at a regular market activity, I am Casio, maker of fine bog standard watches. If a bunch more people want my watches, that is a good problem for me to have. And what I'm very apt to do in a situation where demand is outstripping supply is go, well, we're happy to meet demand. We will use the excess capital that we're generating off of sales in order to build a second factory so that we can crank out even more Casios than we already were. We would say success is defined by the amount of customers that we have and therefore the amount of revenue that we're getting. Whereas when we get into the elite colleges, it's not so much the actual knowledge that is being sold, it's the elitism, it's the pedigree, it's the brand. And so it's almost like Rolex does the numbers and it goes, when we only make 1,000 Rolexes a year, we actually get more money by restricting the amount of Rolexes because the brand becomes so elite and people are willing to pay for it that we can sell this Rolex for $1 million. But if we start cranking out Rolexes, even if they're the exact same quality, then they're going to be worth less. So it's in our interest to collude with all the other elite institutions, a bit like OPEC and oil, and intentionally restrict the amount of degrees coming out, because that's how we pump up our prestige, by rejecting people and by maintaining small amounts of students. And that's ultimately what we want. What we want is to be prestigious.
So that, I think that's exactly right. There's just one thing that I would sort of clarify, because this is something that I think people sometimes get confused with in my argument, which is I think you're exactly right to distinguish between Casio and Rolex, right? So when it comes to Casio, there's not a lot of signaling value to that product. It's essentially, sort of more of a functional product. You use it to actually tell the time. When you buy a Rolex, it's something different. There's a different dimension to it, which is that you're trying to signal your eliteness, your pedigree, the ability that you can afford it, and a bunch of other stuff to the people who see you with the Rolex. And so many people might say, well, elite colleges, places like Harvard, places like Stanford, are much more like the Rolex than they are like the Casio. And I say, let's say that's the case. And actually, there's a big part of the book where I sort of explain why that makes a lot of sense for those institutions to act that way as if they were the Rolex and not the Casio. Even if that's the case, the cartel that they've structured is even too restrictive for a luxury operation. Even if they were a luxury operation, they should still accept more students than they currently do. Now, it's not like they're going to accept everyone, but if the acceptance rates right now are single digits, 2 or 3%, then in a world in which they are actually operating efficiently, even given the logic of being a luxury brand, then they would still accept 7 or 8%. And the fact that they're not doing that actually tells you that even if they are luxury goods, they've become such a strong cartel. They're taking maximal advantage, not just of the luxury aspect, but of the supply side collusion aspect that they've been able to structure with all the other luxury goods. And so I think, a better example would be if you look at the luxury markets, like, LVMH still competes with Gucci or, Kering or whatever. And so in the elite college market, though, because of the way this cartel has been structured, there's virtually no competition, even amongst the luxury providers. Harvard isn't trying to kill Princeton. It's trying to work with Princeton. I think this is the beating heart of the problem. And the second point I'd make is the dysfunction at the elite level, and again, that's what this book is focused on, actually trickles down to all the other, less elite colleges. And so the reason that's the case is because that same U.S. News and World Report rankings that the elite colleges have essentially captured is what the less elite colleges used to measure themselves. And so the metrics that reward elite colleges becoming more elite are the same ones that are warping the incentives of UVA, Virginia Tech, and JMU, so that they become sort of like a mimicry of Harvard and Penn. They sort of adopt all the worst habits of those institutions. And so those worst habits are where Harvard wants, the wealthiest people from around the world. Now UVA wants the wealthiest students from outside of their state. And it's pushing out all the talented students who would otherwise maybe have been let in if the University of Virginia or if Virginia Tech had a different set of incentives, as opposed to becoming as close to a copycat Harvard as is currently possible under the ranking system. And so that type of dysfunction is what is raising prices at all the public schools, all the schools that don't care so much about prestige, all the Casios, as you might put it in your analogy. And that is really the reason that this college cartel, this elite college cartel, is so poisonous for the rest of the college market.
That's fascinating. And I think that that's a really important thing to point out, because if to swing back into antitrust law for a minute, the relevant factor whenever we get into antitrust legislation or antitrust lawsuits that are leveraged by federal agencies is, how are you defining the market? Because the fierceness of the fish is determined by the size of the tank. So if I, to pick an example completely out of the ether and entirely hypothetically, opposed a merger of Subway sandwiches with Schlotzsky's on the grounds that that would be a monopoly within the sandwich industry, I think most people would go, okay, come on. There's not a sandwich industry. There's a fast food industry. You're intentionally cutting this in such a way as to make it seem like there's a monopoly. So my pushback that I was about to give you was, there are a ton of colleges. There's not just 15. There are hundreds of colleges throughout the United States. But you're saying that the kind of cartel economics that are employed by the elite universities is employed to a lesser degree downriver at flagship state universities like what I went to, Bush League universities, state colleges, so on and so forth. And as a result, all of them are engaging in behavior where we want to build up our endowment as much as we can, and we want to reject as many students as we can, because that relationship between endowment and approval of students is the prestige metric that we're all going off of. Something like that?
So that's exactly right. So, you can... Line drawing is always a funny exercise when it comes to defining markets, I think, as you pointed out with your FTC Subway merger example. But I think, it's intuitively plausible to most people that Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Stanford are not competing necessarily with, Virginia Tech or JMU or Christopher Newport University or any of these other schools. I think that's at least intuitively plausible that there's some line. And so the question then is, where do we draw the line? I would posit to you, just as a sort of, to push this conversation along, let's say that the top 25 colleges in the U.S. News and World Report ranking are sort of in their own market. And let's say that, and I think this is generally true, that only 2% of the university students in America go to those top 25 schools, which means that other 98%, and again, you can draw a bunch of other lines in that 98%, such as, sort of like close to prestigious, so maybe from 25 to 50, 50 to 100, 100 to 200, whatever. And there's all these things that you can do to define all these submarkets. But that other 98%, by and large, still evaluates itself by how prestigious the school is according to the U.S. News and World Report. And the reason that's the case is because these universities are not for profit by and large. They don't have shareholders, they don't have dividends, they don't have a P&L, bottom line. And so the way in which they evaluate whether or not they're doing well is if they're moving up or down in the rankings. This is what state legislators also look at. It's sort of become this heuristic shortcut for these universities to optimize around. And the other aspect of this that is important is that the rankings serve this sort of important function in the market, which is, one of the reasons to go to university is so that it's easier for you to get a job in the first job market. And the rankings sort of tells an employer very quickly, very easily, when they're looking at a resume, sort of generally, how elite is this student? And by elite, you might infer all sorts of characteristics: social background, IQ, X, Y, and Z. Skills in their major, and other opportunities, and this type of thing. And that's important because in the first job market, it's very difficult for an employer to figure out what's wheat and what's chaff. In other words, if I'm looking at a bunch of people who are applying for, their first job in terms of their career, in terms of what they really want to do, it's very difficult for me to know who's good and who's not. I have to take a lot of time and figure that out. But if I have this heuristic where they went to college, and I know from the ranking generally how prestigious that college is, my job becomes much easier. And this is something we see for right or wrong, we see this in job markets all the time, which is employers basically filter by where you went to university.
Great. So there's a couple of things to parse out here. I apologize for just repeating stuff, but this is fascinating to me. I want to make sure that I understand the mechanics of this. If you're looking at a for-profit corporation, it's fairly transparent whether it's doing well or not. You can look at how many toasters are you selling? What's your profit margin on the toasters? And we can quibble on you're investing too much in R&D. It should just go to the dividends or whatever. But basically, there's a clear metric to see the health and success of the business, which also provides an incentive for people to buy stock in it. It seems to be a worthwhile institution. Therefore, I'm going to inject capital into it by purchasing stock, so on and so forth. No such metrics exists with colleges. And so the next best alternative is rankings in U.S. news, and those are done by prestige. So it could be that Harvard and Stanford and Yale, they have so much money that they're only concerned with prestige. It's just a status game for them. That's a possibility. But there's also a very high likelihood that there's a monetary incentive here, because if we're doing really well in prestige, we're more likely to get money from our donors. We're more likely to have money added to our endowment. If we're a state university that's following suit and you've slipped down 10 rankings, the state legislature might go, well, we're not allocating any more money to you. You're a loser institution. But if it's gaining, they might go, well, hot damn, the University of Virginia is actually doing pretty well. Let's give them some more money. So it becomes the most relevant data in terms of resource accumulation for universities. And again, the main way of determining prestige insofar as the data exists is how much money are you spending per student and what is your acceptance rate? And so you're always incentivized to get money for the endowment and turn away as many people as you can, because that means you're more prestigious.
So that's basically exactly right. And the one thing I would maybe clarify there is, you've sort of framed it as there's a resource motivation, which is why the schools care about prestige. But I could, very plausibly understand the other story too, which is that there's a prestige motivation, which is why the universities care about resources. Because as you mentioned, the way to climb up the U.S. News and World Report rankings is to gather more resources and spend it on less students. That's the essential logic of the U.S. News and World Report. Maximize the amount of revenue, minimize the amount of students that you're spending that revenue on. So spending per student is, as long as you can jack up that metric, you will do very well in those rankings. And so, I'm sure there's a combination of both monetary and prestige motivations, probably prestige on behalf of the people who are most interested in that, such as, the trustees, the president, and really the high level people. And, there's also this revenue motivation for sort of the grifters who are associated with the university, because the fatter the pig, the more they can sort of squeeze out of it.
So I'm with you 100% so far, but I want to play devil's advocate. I want to try and give some good faith arguments against our position here. A lot of my friends would immediately go, Heaton and Sahaj, you guys are trying to see the entire world through economics. Not everything is a market. Not everything is a business. Not everything should have a profit motive. And colleges are a pristine example of something that should be untethered from a profit motive. And you're trying to apply something that's kind of icky and self-interested to something that ought to be a charity. How would you respond to them?
Look, I think you did a very good job when you sort of described this model of everyone's at the center of their own universe, right? And I think that is actually a very fundamental insight truth about human nature, which is that self-interest ultimately does matter, no matter what people end up saying. And it's not maybe it's not for this malignant reason that they're greedy or selfish or, you can sort of strip the morality away from it and just, it still happens to be true. And now in the university context, there are all these examples that I can point to where there's this self-interested, almost like, and certainly monetarily interested behavior that's exhibited quite openly. And so, from if you're in the startup world, what you might be familiar with is tech transfer offices and them trying to sort of commercialize their IP in maximally extractive ways by, essentially grabbing big chunks of equity in startups that are spun out using, university IP. That certainly is not something that's just purely for the spread of knowledge. In the, tuition context, I think the fact that tuition has gone up so dramatically is something that's very difficult to explain outside of, some sort of monetary motivation. I think if you look at the endowments and how admissions is sort of catered to prioritize donors' children or relatives, and this is something that has been publicly reported in all sorts of ways. I think it's, again, very hard to tell a story that is not at least, tangentially monetarily interested. If you look at the Varsity Blues scandal, where wealthy people were corrupting tennis coaches and other types of athletic coaches to get their kids in, again, there's a deeply self-interested story there. And all of these things, I think, are downstream of the main story, which is essentially, the universities have grown phenomenally wealthy in a way that they weren't before. And, I don't think that just happens by accident. I think, it's very difficult to accumulate resources in this world, and there has to be a concerted and motivated effort to make that happen. And you see this all the time when the vast majority of presidents at elite universities spend a tremendous amount of time going to fundraisers, spending time with donors. All of this stuff is very monetarily interested, very monetarily motivated. I think it's very difficult to tell any other kind of story around any of this type of stuff. And this is even excluding the antitrust cases around price fixing and whatever else.
And we should note, for an industry that we might feel should not be subject to financial incentives and it should be above all of that, it's doing very well with financial incentives. Like, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I want to say globally, higher education's like $1 trillion industry. The Harvard has a $50 billion endowment, $50 billion. There's an incredible amount of money there. And one of the things that I start to look at is let's say if we add up the endowments, the top 25, that it's $300 billion. I don't know what it is.
But it's plus. Yeah, something like
that. It's something like that. Granted, I don't work in education, but if you went, hey, Heaton and Sahaj, if we give you $300 billion to promote knowledge, do you think you could come up with a model that's different than our current model of not having more students? I think we would go, actually, yes, with $300 billion, if our goal is to promote knowledge, we would definitely come up with something other than not having more students. We would come up with new models. We would have satellite campuses. Like, with $50 billion, Harvard could open up a satellite campus in every state of the union and, expand the franchise and the amount of minds that are available to it. But it's not going to do that because that would hurt the elitism of it.
So, and I think that's exactly right. And I'd actually contextualize that with some anecdotes, which is, some of the greatest minds of the Renaissance period, of the 19th century, of the 20th century, people like Da Vinci, people like Faraday, people like Abraham Lincoln, were essentially self-taught, and they were able to exploit what was this massive technological innovation, which was the printing press, to read in the back of barns, to conduct experiments, to go on lecture circuits, and to teach themselves all these phenomenal skills that then went on to change the world. The question I think you have to ask is, has technology become available, which should have lowered the cost of acquiring knowledge in the last 30 years, at the same time at which universities got more and more and more expensive? And, we talk all the time in Silicon Valley about the information revolution, the internet, Wikipedia, Google, now ChatGPT, YouTube, all of these tools for information becoming accessible to your fingertips have dramatically exploded access to information. And yet the university, the place whose job it is to distribute information, seemingly has taken very little advantage of these tools. To the extent that it has, with eras like Zoom University, it was sort of thrusted upon it. And even then, very haphazardly, reluctantly, and I would say poorly, sort of what were those tools adopted and used. And so the question I think you have to ask is, exactly what you said earlier. If you had $300 billion in reserve and your pure motive was to disseminate and distribute information and knowledge and skills as cheaply as possible to as many people as possible, why wouldn't you be incorporating more of these technologies, which have essentially brought down the cost of distribution to zero? Why is this not happening? And I think, again, as with what you were saying, the whole idea is this signaling idea, this elitism idea, and frankly, the scarcity idea, which is all monetarily motivated, and very little of that has anything to do with the distribution of knowledge.
So if I were Harvard, I think what I would say is we're doing all of those things that you're asking for. Right now, you may not be able to get into Harvard proper, which has a limited amount of seats that we allocate based on structural impediments that we have nothing to do with, of where we can expand in Cambridge, which is, zoning and expensive real estate, and also quality controls that we're worried about. But we really do believe in knowledge, and for that reason, we have the Harvard Extension School. The Harvard Extension School, you don't have to be accepted to. You can take the same classes and textbooks that we provide to all of the students, and it'll cost you a fraction. I think to get a degree from Harvard Extension School is like $10,000. So that's great, right? And if that's too much for you and you really just want the knowledge, you don't even want a certificate, no problem. We, Harvard, as well as Stanford and MIT and a number of other schools, we put all of our lectures for free online. They're on YouTube. You can go on Coursera. You can go on edX. We fundamentally believe in our mission, and therefore we have promulgated all of this knowledge. It's just that people aren't availing themselves to it. Well, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, so there's sort of a twin response I make, and MIT OpenCourseWare is something I talk about, which is, the way I frame it is during the pandemic, whether you were actually enrolled at MIT and taking classes on Zoom, or you were availing yourself of MIT OpenCourseWare, which is, as you said, they upload a lot of their lectures and homeworks and exams online, so you can basically mimic what a student would have gotten at Zoom University at MIT. There should have been virtually no difference, or as close to no difference as possible between those two options during the pandemic. And so, economic theory would tell you that a lot of students would drop out of MIT and sort of just avail themselves of MIT OpenCourseWare, or at least more so than had in the past. But that didn't really happen. So I think the question you have to ask is, okay, well, why not? I think there are a couple of reasons here, some of which are the fault of the universities, and some of which you might say are just facts of life. And so one of the faults of the universities is, number one, I think they've done a very bad job of advertising these other tools. MIT OpenCourseWare and all these other courses that are sort of made available online have not gotten the full weight of the marketing machine that we know that the universities have, because they're able to get students who have no chance of ever being accepted to these schools to fill out an application and go through the tedium of writing a bunch of essays to apply to these schools. But they are not equivalently using that marketing machine to push MIT OpenCourseWare or any of these course catalogs into the hands of those students. But the second aspect of this is, fact of the matter is that the universities have not made it possible to get access to the same credentials if you're using their tools to get access to the same knowledge. And, we sort of began this conversation talking about the signaling value of the universities. Well, if you're not given an MIT degree at the end of finishing your MIT OpenCourseWare module coursework, then ultimately, again, in that first job market, no one's going to know how to evaluate you. Are you good or are you not? How do we know that if we hire Andrew, if we hire Sahaj, this will be a person who will contribute to the workforce? And so the fact that they've sort of foreclosed access to the real credential, and I think, even you had a bit of a smile when you mentioned Harvard Extension School. There's this snobbish feeling about those alternative pathways because they're so clearly distinguished in the marketing materials from the actual thing. And because of all of that, it's almost like a negative signal. It's actually worse to go and get a Harvard Extension degree.
Oh, you went to failure Harvard. Okay.
Right.
Thanks for letting me know you went to failure Harvard, not real Harvard. Yeah.
And so the way it's, sort of interpreted and evaluated in the job market is exactly what you said. You went to failure Harvard. Like, we will not even take this candidate seriously. And I think the fact that that's the case, they've created these negative signal products, is also one of the reasons that no one wants to avail themselves of these resources. And so I think in totality, when you take all of that stuff together, both what the universities have done and also how the job market interprets that, essentially they've not really done the things that Andrew, you or I would be able to do with that $300 billion.
I mean, I'm glad that you bring up signaling mechanisms. I think a big, I agree with the fundamental thesis of your book. And I'm also really glad that you invoke William Bennett. I'm very partial to William Bennett's analysis, which for people that are unfamiliar with Bennett or have forgotten our discussions of Bennett on the program, Bennett's thesis was more and more capital is being injected into higher education from the federal government. The colleges are all competing for that money. And so they are building a Olympic pool, and they're starting a study abroad program, and they're making the dorms wonderful, and they're having a gym. They're doing really cool stuff with it, but that all drives up the cost. And so basically we inject money in, the colleges create things to gobble up the money, and then they raise prices to maintain it. And so the reason that college tuition has expanded so rapidly over the last 50 years is, for the most part, we are, one, encouraging more students to go to it, which puts a strain on the resources, and two, there's a capital capture. So we're broadly in agreement with all of it. I'm glad you bring up the signaling mechanism as well, in that I think that college is being conflated as multiple things simultaneously that are causing a lot of these problems. It's mostly a positional good in economic speak. That is to say that a degree is worth something because somebody else doesn't have the degree. And you do a couple of mental exercises in your book. You point out, if you could shadow somebody for 4 years and go to all the same classes and read all the same books, and at the end of that experience, you don't get the degree, is it worth the same? And the answer is an obvious no. Another way we could look at it is, if you go to a college for 3 years and then you drop out before the 4th year, should your income potential be 3/4 of whatever the degree is? And the answer is no. You don't get 1-to-1 credit for the amount of knowledge you've accumulated, because from a financial standpoint, in terms of your career aspirations, not in terms of spiritual fulfillment, not in terms of experiential joy, but in terms of the monetary side of it, which is what we're all arguing about, it's the certificate that's worth the money. It's not the knowledge you accumulated.
Yeah, so all of that is right. I actually really liked the Bill Bennett argument about, we sort of like unleashed all this liquidity into the system. Why would you not think that that's going to distort the market? And that's essentially what's happened. I mean, there's essentially been an infinite liquidity tap into the system where, virtually anyone can borrow money to go to college. That debt can't be discharged, which means that, there's all this willingness to sort of, provide access to debt to go to college. And then, the universities on the supply side have, come up with all these clever ways in which to capture all that liquidity. That's really what's, making the cartel so powerful. First is the inelasticity of demand, which just means essentially people are willing to give up a lot to go to the very elite colleges, that top 25 schools that we mentioned. And for the rest of the market, the other 98% of students, there's essentially infinite liquidity. And at the age of 18, maybe you don't know how to handle, essentially access to $250,000 worth of loans. Maybe you don't know, what kind of obligations you're incurring to go to a school. And therefore, maybe your inelasticity of demand has gone up dramatically because you have access to all this debt as a result of government policy. And, when you sort of factor all of that together and include the fact that the less prestigious schools are now becoming copycat Harvards in terms of exclusivity, then the mini cartels from school number 25 to number 50, from 50 to 100, and so on and so forth. Every branch of this college cartel is essentially doing the exact same thing that the elite colleges are able to do because of the inelasticity of demand for those very prestigious signals. But now it's being recreated because of the inelasticity of demand, because of access to infinite liquidity. And so the net result is these dramatic increases in tuition across the board where, it's 4x the rate of inflation generally, which is such a dramatic thing. When you look at some of these charts, I mean, it's like a hockey stick, like you would like to see in venture capital in terms of, the network effects that you're putting together or something. I mean, essentially, it is an absurd system that we've created with all the worst impulses of government policy and all the worst impulses of very predatory capitalism sort of fused together, and none of the benefits of either.
I've heard people describe Harvard or Yale, insert any elite college that you want. They'll describe them as it's not really a university, it's a hedge fund that happens to teach classes. Do you think such criticisms are well met?
Look, I think rhetorically that's a very powerful criticism. I don't think it's descriptively accurate. I think the fact that there's the hedge fund there is it's what it really is a prestige shop, and the hedge fund essentially allows it to purchase prestige. And so it's not that the school sort of is a branch of the hedge fund. The hedge fund is a subsidiary of the prestige shop of which the school is the central nervous system.
I think that's a fair impulse. I wouldn't go so far as to say they're hedge funds cosplaying as colleges. I think they are, in fact, producing something, although elitism I would describe as the main actual monetary product. That being said, do you see any conflicts of interests between hedge funds and universities?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and this is something I talk about in the book at some length, which is essentially, okay, so now we have, this sort of elite college cartel. We have this collusive deal with the U.S. News and World Report, and you have a bunch of mini-me's copying the elite college cartel via sort of the contagiousness of the rankings. Well, who's really benefiting? And so, this is when I sort of do a bit of analysis about the grifting economy. Who is able to get this money out? Because again, remember, there's no P&L, there are no shareholders, there are no dividends. So how does money, which is trapped in these hedge funds and these endowments, actually get out into greedy individuals who might be looking at these places as ways in which they can enrich themselves? And so some of it is pretty standard, which is the endowments need to invest their money somewhere. And so they pick a variety of hedge funds and private equity funds that may or may not have social relationships to those schools, may or may not have donor relationships to those schools. In some cases, the people who originated those funds may or may not be on the board of trustees at those schools and are able to funnel some of that endowment money back to their old funds or their current funds. And so what ends up happening then is that the owners and operators of those hedge funds and private equity funds end up becoming phenomenally wealthy because they charge fees. And so all that money that is sort of extracted from students ends up being redistributed upwards to the wealthiest people in our society, because those hedge funds charge this 2 and 20 model, and they charge, in the case of private equity, all sorts of other fees, and they're able to enrich themselves not necessarily at the expense of the endowment, but certainly at the expense of the student who's being squeezed to put money into that endowment. Please
continue. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Please continue.
The second place, though, that a lot of this money is sort of being squeezed out is not to any one person, but to an entire class of people. And the class of people could be broadly construed as the administrators. And this is sort of where my book sort of converges with the right-wing critique of universities, which is essentially the right-wing critique of universities, as I understand it, is that right-wing ideas are suppressed on campus. The culture of free speech is something that has increasingly been suppressed at elite universities in particular, but all universities generally. And, the thing I would say is one of the reasons that this might be the case is because so much of the monopoly rents that the colleges have sort of collected are spent by the administrators looking to hire 2 other administrators to work for them so that they can give themselves a promotion and a raise. And when this cancerous sort of growth of bureaucracy really starts to take root, eventually the administrators need to have a reason to exist at that university. Eventually, you need to be able to, sort of spin a lie about why you exist in the institution, because it's becoming too blatant that you don't do any actual work. And the narrative that a lot of these administrators choose to go with is that they're there for student safety, because it's very hard to argue against student safety. And then people ask you the question, well, what are you protecting students against? And you have to come up with a wide variety of dangerous ideas, dangerous people. And this is how, some of the more Marxian ideas start to become embedded within the bureaucracy at the universities, which is that everything is dangerous. People are dangerous against some of the other students. There are deep divisions among students. And this is what the bureaucracy aims to police. And that's how I think, the culture becomes very anti-free speech. No one's trusted to interact with other students everyone is seen through the eyes of suspicion, because that's the sort of safetyism culture you've created on campuses. And all of this, I think, is downstream of the monopoly rights.
You document a lot of conflict of interests in the book. I'll add, one of the things I like about your book is at least 8 times I went, "Hey, yeah!" as I was reading it. There were several things that I'd never thought of before until you articulated them. Like you brought up the Varsity Blues scandal earlier, where the mom from Family Matters or Full House back in the day, if everybody remembers this, had bribed a guy, had paid a guy to bribe officials, I think at Stanford or something, and she ended up doing jail time, or at least going to court, right? There were multiple people that went through this Varsity Blues scandal, and America went, "How dare you bribe a university to get your kid in? That is, evading the whole purpose of this." But meanwhile, if you just go to the university and you go, "I would like to buy you a building," they'll go, "Okay, your kid can come here." Like, it's this weird thing where, like, a small bribe is awful, but a large bribe is fine and absolutely exists. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but like with Harvard and Yale, the majority of the students that are admitted to those institutions are not there based on merit. The majority of them are based on a dean's list, that is to say, probably donors, or athletic scholarships, many of which are questionable athletics. Like, you're there for squash. That means you're rich and you gave money to the university. They wanted to have you, so they went, "Okay, athletic scholarship." But there's actually the minority of people that matriculate through Harvard and Yale are there through a meritocratic process. The majority of people are there through what, when we take a bird's eye view, we would say is either at best athletics or very likely bribery.
Yeah. This is something that was really vivid for me, and I still remember. So I was at Georgetown when the Varsity Blues scandal was sort of uncovered, and I remember, it was such a culture shock for me, because on campus, the view was that these parents had sort of been some version of poor, some version of cheap, some version of sort of miserly, because they hadn't paid the proper bribe in the proper way to the proper place, which is the development office, the donation, and it's $1 million plus. And instead, what they'd done is the back door, paying only $250K, and essentially cheating their way in. And, to me, from my vantage point, it wasn't clear to me that paying more necessarily was so morally different. Instead, my view was sort of, this is such a weird way to interpret what is happening on our campus. And that's one of the reasons I actually wanted to start looking into this book, which is, what are the market structural reasons that explain, how the upper class interprets what's happening versus how the commons might interpret what is happening on these campuses. And I think you're exactly right. There's this elite culture, which is exactly inverted. It's almost like buying indulgences from the Catholic Church in the late 1400s, early 1500s. There's this like deep, steeped culture of corruption, which has its own rituals and dances that make it less corrupt. And I think all of these things, when really exposed to a critical eye, are all wrong. And this is something that all of us ought to be criticized.
Yeah. Another example in your book that had never occurred to me before are the Board of Trustees, or what was called the Board of Regents at my university, where in a political situation, if somebody became a judge by giving $500,000 to a senator, we would go, "Well, that's just a bribe. And he's probably done this in order to get the networking opportunity or something. He didn't do this because he loves the senator." But that's exactly how the Board of Trustees works at universities. You give a ton of money to the university, and then you get to be on the Board of Trustees. And I don't doubt that people that are on the board really care about their university for a moment, but it is a situation where if it were in almost any other field, if you obtained leadership on the board by effectively buying the seat, we would go, might there be any other motivations that are present that we should think about given how much money's exchanged hands here? But we kind of just look away from it when it happens at universities.
Yeah, look, I mean, and again, I think you bring up a good point. Like, you can't paint everyone with the same brush. Maybe not everyone is corrupt. Maybe some people actually do really care about the university, do really care about the network, feel a sense of pride in sort of their inclusion and the governance of these institutions. However, it is absolutely a fact that when you go through who's on the board of trustees at the vast majority of elite universities, it is generally private equity people, hedge fund people, big consultancy people, big law individuals. And when you sort of zoom out and think about, well, why might they want to be on these boards of trustees, then I think it's very difficult to avoid the implication that the social benefits, the social capital that you get from being on one of these boards of trustees, being able to be someone that other wealthy and influential or aspiring people can talk to about getting their children in, and sort of the networking functions, and also access to the endowment. All of these things mean that there are all these side ways in which you can monetize your association with that institution, through these sort of subtle social dances, and the ability to meet all these people in this less sort of explicitly financially interesting way, but ultimately down the line, potentially profitable way. And so, again, this is another example of everyone's center of their own universe. There are incentives at stake here, and it's about time that I think we articulated them.
Great. Well, we're going to wrap up here in a moment, so I'm going to give you a final question, but it's a big question. So take your time with it, and I'm just going to let you roll. You've done a wonderful job of articulating a lot of the structural problems with universities, particularly elite universities, which then trickle down to the rest of the higher education system. I'm very taken with your analysis of this. What do we do? Because it's one thing just to go, gosh darn, these elite universities hogging all the prestige for themselves and keeping the money. What would you, if you had the ear of politicians, if you had the ear of the voter, what would you advise as structural modifications we could make to alleviate these problems?
Yeah, so I break the book down into two different sides, the demand side and the supply side. And I'm going to break my answer down to this into two separate sides too. So on the demand side, I will take a page out of Mr. Bennett's analysis, which is, it's not maybe such a great idea for us to flush the zone with infinite liquidity for kids who are 18 years old. And so I think we need to completely rethink how we finance higher ed. If it's the case that we're going to offer, publicly subsidized debt to students, then the universities need to be on the hook for teaching those students something that they can then monetize and actually pay that debt back. And if they don't, then the university should be on the hook for the debt that remains unpaid. And that's a way that you can sort of bring incentives much more in alignment, which is something that does not happen right now. Right now, the incentive for the university is to encourage the child to borrow as much as possible so that they can sort of make their margin. So that's on the demand side, I think, a pretty big change, something that to me is at least very obvious. I think, as more people really drill down the details, is going to become increasingly obvious in the future. On the supply side, we need to break up all these cartels. The elite college cartel, their collusive arrangement with the rankings relationship with all the other mini cartels that are below the elite college cartel in prestige, but nonetheless are sort of copycat cartels in these different tiers of universities. All of this needs to be broken up. And so how do you do it? I think the first place is we snip the relationship between the rankings and the elite universities. And the way you do that is you either nationalize those. This is something the Obama administration tried to do with the college scorecard effort, weren't able to do, or there's some sort of regulatory process to make sure that there isn't so much elite capture of the way that we do rankings. And in essence, what I would change about the rankings is right now, the simple logic is make school very expensive or gather as much revenue as possible and spend it on as few students as possible. I would invert that entirely. Gather as little revenue as possible and spend it on as many students as possible. And so that, if the definition of technology is doing more with less, then right now the rankings incentivize you to do anti-technology, and I would sort of flip it back to be more technological. And then once you've done that, I think some of the endowments need to be broken up. We need to, start from scratch in terms of redistributing resources all across these different universities and really focus on distributing knowledge as broadly and as well as we possibly can. I think, the university system needs to be much less about signaling, much more about skills. And I think these are some of the ways in which I would think about doing that.
Yeah, one of the things that you brought up in the book that I did not know about is that President Obama had floated a federal ranking of universities during his tenure as president, and it was vociferously opposed by elite universities because they didn't want to have a competing system that might be arranged on other criteria that you've articulated. And by the way, as a tiny government guy that is kind of skeptical about the Department of Education to begin with, that seems like a great thing for the Department of Education to do. Like, I would prefer the Federal Department of Education be mostly informational and advisory. And that seems like a very good informational advisory role for it to fulfill. And then I don't, because I have a lot of caveats of seizing private organizations' assets and things like that, you might be able to talk me into just taking endowments, but probably not. But at least as a starting position, what I would say is any university that has more money in its endowment than the GDP of like half of Africa, let's just not give them any money for tuition assistance from public coffers. Sure. Like, that's just to start with, instead of giving tuition assistance to Harvard, which demonstrably could pay for every single student forever based on their current enrollment rates. Like, I crunched the numbers on this. If Harvard kept the same amount of enrollment, their endowment's growing faster than they could literally free for everybody forever. So like, just don't give them tuition assistance. It's they can do their own thing, but like the tuition assistance would be they would be better served going to community colleges. It would be better served going to public universities that would hopefully be less concerned with rejecting people in order to be prestigious. So I think there's a lot of things to it. I'll say, regardless of the actual nitty gritty details, I love your approach, Sahaj. I love your approach of looking at this in terms of systemic analysis, structural elements. What are the underlying mechanisms that are causing the bad things to happen, and how do we adjust those mechanisms? I think that is the exact mindset that should be applied to this kind of situation, and I applaud you, and have very much enjoyed talking to you.
Well, I really enjoyed this conversation too, Andrew, and thank you so much for having me on as a guest.
My pleasure, and once again, this has been Sahaj Sharda, who is the author of The College Cartel. We probably covered anywhere from 40% to 60% of the book. We certainly didn't cover all of the book. And I will note, not only does it have a lot of information in it that made me think and I learned stuff from it, it's also not the dry think tank literature that you can sometimes blunder into. He has a lot of anecdotes of college students pulling scams that I really enjoyed reading. So I commend the book. You can find that at mightyheaton.com/featured. And Sahaj, come back on the show and keep up the good work.
Great. Thanks, Andrew.
The Political Orphanage is made possible by its own listeners. You can join them, become an elite orphan, by going to patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. Now listen, nothing would please me more than joining a cartel. And not just for the higher money, for the social life and the all-you-can-eat buffets. When I think of cartel, I basically think of the Freemasons, only with neckties instead of those little Shriner hats. But sadly, podcasting is a world in which you pretty just make money if your listeners think it's worth giving you money. I don't like it either, but that's where we are. So let me put a question in your brain. Just scrolling around the internet today, looking at big corporate media websites and TV shows, do you see a lot of asinine partisan nonsense faffing about? Conversely, when you check out this show, do you feel like it's smart content that entertains you or informs you? Well, if so, got bad news. The show's made possible by you. So consider going to patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. You'll not only keep the lights on, you'll get access to a backlog of, 5 years worth of bonus episodes now. That's patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. Thanks. That's the show. Thanks for listening. Thank you, Sahaj Sharda, for coming on to discuss The College Cartel. Thank you, Eric Stipe, who edited today's episode. And thank you, patrons who make it all possible. Until next time, I've been Andrew Heaton, and so have you.